I'm a 27-year-old woman, and for as long as I can remember, Christmas dinner has meant one thing: piling into my mom's car and driving out to my Aunt Lorraine's big countryside house. It's the kind of place that looks like it belongs on the cover of a holiday magazine. A long gravel driveway, tall pine trees wrapped in lights, wreaths on every window. Inside, it smells like cinnamon, polished wood, and something roasting in the oven. It's warm and beautiful, but every year comes with a silent understanding. Lorraine runs the show. Lorraine's control over the evening is legendary in our family. She decides who's invited, where each person sits, even which wine is acceptable to bring. If you're on her good side, you get prime seating near the fireplace. If you're not, you're somewhere by the kitchen door, in the constant draft of people coming and going. Somehow, despite her sharp edges, I've always been on the guest list, probably because of my cake. Every year, I bring the same thing: a triple-layer chocolate cake with espresso buttercream, topped with shavings of dark chocolate. Lorraine has called it the only dessert worth serving, though she says it in a tone that makes it sound like I'm just following orders. This year felt different even before the snow started falling. At Thanksgiving, Lorraine made a big, confident claim about a historical event, one I happened to know was wrong. I corrected her politely, but it was in front of a small crowd. She smiled without warmth, changed the subject, and for the rest of the night she avoided me. I thought maybe she'd get over it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, a short text popped up on my phone. It was from Lorraine. She told me I'd been too disrespectful at Thanksgiving and wouldn't be invited to Christmas this year. That was it. No explanation, no discussion, just a ban. I might have let it go if I hadn't received screenshots from a cousin the next day. In the family group chat, Lorraine was telling people she wanted a more polite atmosphere this year with no unnecessary arguments. The phrasing made it sound like I was some kind of troublemaker who ruined family events. My mom, careful as always, didn't take a side but admitted Lorraine never backs down from these things. My brother, on the other hand, laughed and suggested I spend Christmas with our dad's side of the family. But I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of cutting me out of something I'd been part of my whole life. I started thinking about loopholes, and one name came to mind: Martin. He's in his 60s, a retired firefighter, and was my late uncle's best friend. Years ago, he pulled Lorraine's dog out of a frozen pond during a blizzard. Ever since, she's treated him like a hero. I called Martin and explained the situation. He laughed and said, "Let's make an entrance." Just like that, the plan was set. If I showed up with Martin, Lorraine would either have to welcome us both or cause a scene in front of the one person she never criticizes. On Christmas Eve, I put on a red dress, not too flashy, but memorable, and Martin pulled up in his old but spotless vintage truck. The snow was fresh and untouched on the long driveway, the lights glowing against the dark winter sky. 2 cousins were outside smoking, and as soon as they saw us, one of them ducked inside. When we reached the porch, Lorraine opened the door. Her eyes landed on me for a split second before she lit up at the sight of Martin. She hugged him tightly, holding onto his arms as if she couldn't believe he was there. I got a quick nod, then she swept us inside. Cousin Jenna caught my eye from across the room and mouthed "wow" as we walked past. Lorraine led Martin to the dining table like an honored guest, introducing him to relatives who hadn't met him yet. To my surprise, she sat me right beside him, in one of the best seats in the house. I set my cake on the dessert table. Lorraine glanced at it and said it looked better than last year's, which, coming from her, was practically a standing ovation. Martin made a point of telling the table that I was the most thoughtful person in the family, loud enough for everyone to hear. My cousins exchanged small smirks, clearly enjoying the change in atmosphere. When Lorraine started telling a long story about a charity gala, Martin casually redirected the conversation toward my latest freelance project. People leaned in, asking questions, and Lorraine's voice faded into the background. The rest of the night stayed smooth. No raised voices, no drama, just polite conversation, and a few sideways glances from her. The next morning, my phone buzzed with messages from cousins saying the night had been one for the books. Mid-morning, Lorraine called. Her tone was clipped. She said she would have appreciated knowing Martin was coming. I told her I thought it would be a nice surprise since she always spoke highly of him. She accused me of manipulating the situation and undermining her role as host. I reminded her she'd uninvited me over a small disagreement, and I wasn't willing to miss a family tradition. After a short pause, she ended the call. A cousin later told me Lorraine had complained privately that I played her own game against her. Martin texted to say he'd had a great time and hoped it reminded her what family means. Even my mom admitted she was proud I'd stayed calm and still made my point. My brother joked about hiring Martin for future disputes. A few days later, Lorraine sent a polite message in the group chat thanking everyone for coming and, very briefly, mentioning me at the end. After that, relatives started reaching out directly to make plans without going through her first. Martin invited me to a small New Year's get-together at his place, promising it would be drama-free. And for the first time, cousins started asking for my cake recipe. It was a small shift, but it felt like the balance in the family was different now, not because of a fight, but because everyone had seen another way the holidays could go. And I was already thinking about what might come next. The snow had fallen steady through the night, covering the long gravel driveway in a smooth white blanket. Tall pine trees along the edge of Aunt Lorraine's property glistened under the weight of it, their branches dusted like something out of a Christmas card. Her house stood at the end, every window lit and glowing warm against the crisp winter air. Martin's vintage truck rumbled down the road, tires crunching over the packed snow. The deep green paint was polished enough to catch the light from the yard's decorations. As we pulled in, 2 of my cousins stood near the side porch, bundled in thick coats and passing a cigarette back and forth. One of them froze mid-puff when they saw who was behind the wheel, then nudged the other. They both stared for a second before one of them flicked the cigarette into the snow and hurried inside. We hadn't even made it up the porch steps before the door opened. Lorraine stood there in a deep burgundy dress with a matching silk scarf. Her eyes flicked over me for a brief second before her face broke into a wide smile aimed squarely at Martin. She stepped forward quickly, arms outstretched, and hugged him as though they hadn't seen each other in years. Her hands stayed on his arms as she looked him over, telling him he looked fantastic without actually saying it. My presence got a quick nod and a polite come in. The warmth from inside hit immediately, carrying the smells of roasted meat, baked bread, and something sweet. The living room was filled with family, voices overlapping in conversation. Lights were strung across the mantel, and the big Christmas tree stood by the window, ornaments glinting in the glow. Cousin Jenna caught sight of us from across the room. Her eyebrows shot up and she mouthed wow before turning to give a quick look toward the kitchen where Lorraine was leading Martin. He was introduced to the relatives who hadn't met him yet, each one getting a firm handshake and a smile. Lorraine walked beside him like she was escorting royalty, her hand brushing his arm every so often. At the dining table, she made sure Martin had the center seat, right where conversation naturally flowed. She gestured for me to sit beside him, a position usually reserved for one of her favorites. Around us, chatter was light, and people leaned toward Martin almost immediately, asking about his recent projects, his old firefighting stories, and his travels. Before the main course, I slipped into the kitchen to place my triple-layer chocolate cake on the dessert table. The glossy ganache topping caught the light from the overhead fixtures. Lorraine passed through, glanced at it, and remarked that it looked better than last year's. It was said with her usual cool tone, but the fact that she said anything at all drew a few sideways glances from the aunts in the room. Back at the table, Martin was in the middle of telling a story about the time he rescued a goat that had gotten itself stuck on the roof of a barn. Laughter rolled around the table. When he noticed me sitting down, he clapped a hand to my shoulder, and loud enough for the table to hear, said I was the most thoughtful person in the family for making the effort to be there with the cake. Several people turned to look at me with smiles, and even Jenna smirked behind her glass. I kept my role steady, helping pass dishes, refilling water glasses, and tossing in small compliments about Lorraine's centerpiece and table arrangement. Every now and then, I caught my cousins exchanging quick, amused looks as they picked up on the shift in the evening's tone. Halfway through dinner, Lorraine started into one of her long, detailed stories about a charity gala she'd attended. Her voice carried just enough to make sure everyone heard about the important people she'd spoken to. Before she could get too deep into it, Martin leaned forward and asked me about the work I'd been doing recently. The change in topic was so smooth that the others didn't hesitate to follow along. Soon, the table was asking questions about a local project I'd completed, and Lorraine's voice faded into the background. Plates were cleared, and conversation kept circling back to Martin and me. People wanted to hear about the trips Martin had taken, and they kept pulling me in to share the food and places I'd discovered while freelancing. Lorraine's contributions to the conversation became shorter, and she spent more time watching than speaking. When dessert time came, my cake was the first thing people went for. Slices were passed around, and more than one person commented that it was the best one yet. Lorraine stood near the coffee pot, offering refills with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As the evening wore on, the group shifted into the living room for coffee in small bites. The fire crackled in the hearth, and clusters of relatives formed around different conversations. Martin ended up in the middle of one about local history, and I joined a smaller group near the tree talking about travel plans for the coming year. At one point, I noticed Lorraine approach Martin with a plate of cookies, leaning down to say something quietly. He smiled, nodded, and then called me over to show him a photo one of the uncles had dug up from years ago. She stepped back with a polite smile but didn't rejoin the group. By the time coats were being pulled from the hooks by the door, Martin was still surrounded by a small circle of people swapping goodbyes and promises to catch up again soon. Lorraine stood by the door, offering quick farewells, but the energy of the night was already past her. The snow outside had stopped, and the driveway glistened under the porch lights. As Martin and I walked back to the truck, I glanced back to see Jenna standing just inside the doorway, giving me a thumbs up before closing the door behind her. The ride back down the long driveway was quiet, except for the hum of the engine and the crunch of the tires. Martin seemed in good spirits, humming a little as we passed the dark fields on either side. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a few messages from cousins. Short notes about how much fun the night had been, with little winking emojis or comments about making an entrance. None of them needed to spell it out. The shift in the evening had been clear. It hadn't been loud or confrontational. It had been steady, deliberate, and noticed by everyone who mattered. And as the night settled in, it was hard to ignore the sense that things might not go back to the way they'd been before. The morning after Christmas, my phone lit up before I'd even made coffee. Messages came in one after another, cousins saying the night had been one for the books, a couple of them adding laughing emojis or little remarks about how smooth the whole thing had been. One even sent a blurry photo from the night. Martin in mid-story, everyone leaning in, and Lorraine in the background looking like she'd just swallowed a lemon. Around mid-morning, my phone rang. Lorraine's name was on the screen. Her voice was clipped, the kind she used when she wanted to sound polite but was already annoyed. She mentioned she would have preferred to know Martin was coming. The way she said it, you could almost hear the effort she was making not to outright scold me. I told her I thought it would be a nice surprise, especially since she'd always spoken so highly of him. There was a pause, and then her tone shifted sharper. She said I'd manipulated the evening and undermined her role as host. The words were precise, like she'd rehearsed them. I reminded her that she'd uninvited me over something small, and I wasn't about to skip a tradition I'd been part of my whole life. There was a moment of silence, long enough to hear the faint hum of her fridge in the background, and then she ended the call without another word. Not long after, my phone buzzed again. A cousin told me she'd already been venting in the group chat she managed with her trusted relatives. Apparently, her exact words were that I'd played her own game against her and used her weakness for Martin. The way my cousin wrote it, it sounded more like admiration than outrage. Martin texted later in the afternoon. He said the night had been one of the best he'd had in years and hoped it reminded Lorraine what family means. He also mentioned he'd gotten a couple of calls from relatives thanking him for coming. By the evening, my mom called. She didn't get into gossip, but she said she was proud I'd kept things calm while making my point. That was her way of saying she approved without stepping fully into the drama. My brother was less subtle. He called laughing, saying we should put Martin on retainer for family events. A few days passed without much noise. Then, out of nowhere, a group text came through from Lorraine. It was polite, almost formal, thanking everyone for coming to Christmas dinner and for making it such a memorable night. Near the end, she tacked on a brief line about my cake being well received. No one commented directly in the chat, but a cousin screenshot it to me with a lol written underneath. After that, something shifted. Instead of going through Lorraine for plans, people started texting me directly. An aunt messaged about meeting for lunch. 2 cousins invited me to join them for a weekend trip they were planning. Even simple things like sharing photos started happening without her as the go-between. Right before New Year's, Martin called. He was hosting a small gathering at his place. Nothing big, just a handful of friends, some neighbors, and whoever from the family wanted to stop by. He promised it would be drama-free and told me to bring my cake if I felt like it. Word of Martin's party must have spread, because 2 cousins messaged me asking for my cake recipe, claiming they wanted to make it for their own celebrations. Lorraine had never shared it when she'd been the one serving my cake at her events, so the requests felt like another little change in the wind. New Year's Eve at Martin's place was exactly as he'd promised. His house was warm, the smell of wood smoke from the fireplace mixing with cinnamon from the mulled cider simmering on the stove. Neighbors dropped in carrying trays of food, people played cards at the kitchen table, and the TV in the living room was tuned to the countdown. 2 of my cousins showed up and immediately asked if I'd brought the cake. When I pointed to it on the counter, one of them cut a slice before even taking off her coat. There was no formality, no wait until dessert rule, and no one keeping score of who talked to who. Around 11, Martin made a little toast thanking everyone for coming and keeping things light. People laughed, glasses clinked, and the atmosphere stayed easy until midnight. No tension, no side comments, just a genuine, relaxed celebration. In the weeks after, I noticed the change sticking. Text chains popped up without Lorraine's name in them. Cousins started planning a ski weekend and invited me straight into the group chat. My mom even mentioned that a few relatives had been talking about making some holiday traditions more collaborative next year. It wasn't like Lorraine disappeared from the picture. She still posted in the family group chat and sent out reminders for birthdays, but the air had shifted. The kind of control she'd always had over how and when the family gathered wasn't as tight as before. It wasn't the result of a fight or a dramatic confrontation. It happened quietly, through small things. Martin's presence, the cake being served without her as the gatekeeper, cousins choosing to go direct instead of through her. Looking back, Christmas had done more than just get me back to the table. It had started something that was still unfolding, and from the way things were going, Lorraine was beginning to realize she couldn't pull the same strings she once did. About 2 weeks after Christmas, an envelope showed up in my mailbox. The handwriting on the front was neat and formal, Lorraine style. Inside was a thick, cream-colored card with gold trim. It was an invitation to a winter appreciation dinner at her house, supposedly to thank family members for their help during the holidays. The wording was polished, but it stood out. Lorraine rarely hosted 2 big events in one season, making this unusual. That same evening, my mom called. She sounded more puzzled than anything. She couldn't remember a time Lorraine had ever done back-to-back gatherings, let alone something labeled as an appreciation dinner. The tone of the invite didn't match the usual family get-togethers. It felt like a performance. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a message from one of my cousins. It was a screenshot, sent to me, supposedly by mistake, instead of someone else. It showed part of a group chat I wasn't in. Lorraine had written that she was planning to set the record straight at the dinner. No details, just that line, followed by a few thumbs-up reactions from her usual circle. That decided it for me. I wasn't going to bring Martin this time. Repeating the same move would be too easy for her to spin. Instead, I called Lily. She's a friend of mine, a local newspaper photographer with a sharp sense of humor and a knack for reading a room. She agreed right away, curious to see the family theater I'd told her about. The night of the dinner, the driveway was already lined with cars. Snow was piled neatly along the edges, and the windows glowed against the dark. Lorraine opened the door herself. She greeted Lily politely, but her expression flickered for a split second like she was trying to place her. They'd met years ago at a charity event, though it was clear the memory wasn't a warm one. Inside, the dining room was set up like something from a magazine. Long table, silver candlesticks, place cards with everyone's names. The seating was arranged with care, and I noticed mine was just 2 spots away from Lorraine, close enough to hear her but not directly across from her. Dinner started with the usual small talk. People commented on the weather, upcoming vacations, and the food. Lorraine steered the conversation toward the importance of respecting a host's wishes, weaving it into a story about how hard it is to keep large gatherings harmonious. Her voice was light, but the words carried weight. Halfway through the main course, she told a funny anecdote about guests who caused disruption by bringing surprises that shifted the focus of an event. The laughter around the table was polite, but I caught a couple of cousins glancing my way. Lily didn't miss a beat. She smiled, leaning slightly forward, and said, Oh, like when Samantha brought Martin to Christmas? He was such a joy to talk to. Her tone was warm, but the timing was deliberate. A few relatives chuckled, some nodding in agreement. Lorraine's smile tightened just enough for those watching closely to notice. About 20 minutes later, Lorraine stood and suggested a quick rearrangement of seats to help conversation flow. In the shuffle, I was moved to the far end of the table, while she filled the empty spot near her with one of her allies from the family. If she thought that would quiet things, it didn't work. Even from my new seat, the conversation kept circling back to me. An uncle asked about my latest project, and two aunts started talking about the chocolate cake from Christmas, saying they hoped I'd bring it again next year. The praise carried easily down the table, and I could see Lorraine keeping her eyes on her plate. Dessert was served, small tarts and coffee, and people started drifting into smaller groups around the living room. Lily and I ended up near the fire, talking with a couple of cousins, and looking over some of Lily's phone photos from recent assignments. Every now and then, someone else would join in, adding to the circle. When it was time to leave, Lorraine came to the door to see guests off. Her words were polite, but her gaze didn't linger. Out on the porch, Lily leaned in and whispered that Lorraine's attempt to steer the evening had fallen flat. The snow crunched under our boots as we walked back to the car. The house behind us was still glowing, but the energy inside had already shifted. From the way things had played out, it was clear that whatever Lorraine had planned for that dinner hadn't gone the way she wanted. And judging by the look she'd given as we left, she wasn't finished trying. Martin called me one Thursday afternoon, his voice full of energy. He'd gotten tickets to a firefighter charity gala, big dinner, live music, a raffle. It was being held at one of the nicest hotels in the city, and he thought it would be good fun if I came along. I agreed, and he said he'd pick me up Saturday evening. I decided on a navy evening gown, floor length with a fitted waist and a subtle shimmer under the lights. It was simple but carried enough elegance for a formal event. The only jewelry I wore was a small diamond necklace my grandmother had given me years ago, the kind that caught the light just enough to be noticed without feeling flashy. The venue was already busy when we arrived. The lobby was lined with framed photos of past firefighting crews, and the main ballroom was full of people, community leaders, business owners, local officials, and a good number of firefighters in dress uniform. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across the tables, and the air buzzed with conversation and the faint sound of a jazz trio playing near the stage. We'd been there about half an hour, moving from one group to another as Martin introduced me to people he knew, when I spotted a familiar figure across the room. Lorraine stood near the stage in an emerald green gown, speaking animatedly to a city council member I recognized from the news. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she held a champagne flute like it was part of the outfit. She didn't notice us until we were almost halfway across the room. Her words faltered for a second, her eyes catching on Martin's arm linked with mine. Then, just as quickly, she smoothed her expression into one of polite surprise, lifting her glass slightly in acknowledgement. Martin steered us toward a group near the bar, introducing me to a retired fire chief and his wife. Lorraine drifted closer, clearly listening but not fully joining in. When a council member stopped by to greet Martin, he mentioned having heard about a very diplomatic Christmas dinner and praised me for it. Lorraine let out a soft laugh and smoothly shifted the subject to her own charitable work, telling the council member about a fundraiser she was planning. The rest of the evening was a mix of mingling and chance run-ins. Every so often, we'd end up in the same conversation circle as Lorraine. She kept her tone light, her smile intact, but there was a stiffness in how she moved around the room. While Martin chatted with a group of business owners, I spotted Lily working the event as the official photographer. She grinned when she saw me, and later caught a candid shot of Martin and me laughing together. In the background of the photo, Lorraine stood mid-glare, looking in our direction. The raffle was held just before dessert. A hush fell over the room as numbers were called. Near the end, Martin elbowed me lightly when my ticket number came up for the grand prize, a weekend getaway at a lakeside resort. Applause filled the room, and Martin gave a loud cheer that drew a few laughs from nearby tables. Not long after, I noticed Lorraine slipping toward the exit. She paused to speak with someone near the coat check, then disappeared into the lobby. A few minutes later, one of the hotel staff mentioned she'd said she had a busy morning ahead. When the evening wound down, Martin suggested a quick drink at the hotel bar before heading home. We found a small table near the window, the city lights stretching out beyond the glass. He shook his head, still amused by the little moments between Lorraine and me that night. By the time I got home, the raffle certificate was tucked safely in my bag, and Lily had already sent me the photo she'd taken. Seeing Lorraine's expression in the background made it clear this wasn't just about Christmas anymore. Whatever she'd been trying to hold on to wasn't slipping quietly out of her hands. And from the look of things, the next round was already on its way. My mom called me in early March with an idea. She wanted to host my birthday this year, somewhere nice, with both sides of the family invited. It wasn't something we usually did. Birthdays were smaller affairs, but she thought it might be a good excuse for everyone to catch up in a neutral setting. I hesitated. Bringing everyone together under one roof meant a high risk of awkward moments, especially if Lorraine attended. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like an opportunity to set the tone on my own turf, without her running the show. I told my mom I was in. We settled on a high-end Italian restaurant in the city, one with a private dining room that could seat around 20. The space had floor-to-ceiling windows, soft lighting, and an open view into the kitchen where chefs moved quickly between stations. It was upscale but warm, the kind of place where people automatically lower their voices a little. The guest list was straightforward: immediate family, a handful of cousins, and a couple of close family friends. Then one cousin called with a small but telling detail. Lorraine had RSVP'd with +1 next to her name. No name given, no hint as to who it would be. The night of the dinner, the private dining room was set with white tablecloths, candles, and small vases of fresh flowers. I was greeting people as they came in when Lorraine appeared in the doorway. She wore a dark fitted dress with pearl earrings, and on her arm was a man in his 40s, clean cut in a tailored navy suit. She introduced him as a real estate developer. She was advising on a community project. He had the kind of firm handshake and quick smile that suggested he was used to networking. I greeted them warmly, making sure not to give her any opening for pointed remarks. The server poured wine, and everyone took their seats. Once the appetizers were placed, platters of bruschetta, arancini, and marinated olives, my mom stood for the opening toast. She shared a childhood memory of me making birthday cakes out of mud in the backyard, complete with flower petals for decoration. Laughter filled the room, and she raised her glass in a genuine wish for the year ahead. When she sat down, Lorraine spoke up. She mentioned how much I'd matured over the years, her tone walking a fine line between praise and a subtle reminder of past disagreements. A couple of cousins glanced my way, reading between the lines. Just as the first round of pasta dishes arrived, the door to the dining room opened again. My brother walked in, followed by Martin. My brother grinned as he took a seat, clearly enjoying the timing of his surprise guest. Martin was in a charcoal suit, carrying a small gift bag, and greeted the table like he'd known everyone for years. Lorraine's reaction was almost imperceptible, just a brief stillness in her face before she smoothed it over with a smile. The conversation picked up instantly. Martin's humor and easy storytelling pulled people in, and soon the room was alive with laughter and overlapping voices. Even the developer Lorraine had brought seemed more interested in Martin's stories than in whatever topic she was trying to steer him toward. Plates of risotto and handmade ravioli came and went, glasses refilled with wine or sparkling water. At one point, Martin launched into a tale about a botched community parade float from years ago, complete with hand gestures that had half the table wiping their eyes from laughing so hard. Lorraine kept her composure, but her companion leaned in toward Martin more than once, asking questions and laughing at the right moments. She didn't interrupt, but her focus stayed on watching the table's energy. When it was time for dessert, the staff brought out a custom tiramisu, topped with happy birthday and cocoa powder. The candles flickered as the whole room joined in singing. The sound was warm, not the rushed, half-muttered version you sometimes get in restaurants. As the cake was served, Martin stood and gave a short toast. He talked about the importance of loyalty and respect in family, about how the best celebrations are the ones where people feel welcome and included. The words were simple, but they landed. People raised their glasses, some nodding along. The last hour of the night felt unhurried. Small groups formed around the table, and most guests lingered near Martin and me, chatting and sharing stories. Lorraine stayed polite, but hung back, her developer friend drifting into another conversation entirely. When the bill was settled and coats were gathered, the shift in the room was clear. The evening had been mine, not by force, but because everyone had chosen to be part of the same relaxed, easy rhythm. Lorraine, standing off to the side, watched the goodbyes without stepping into the center of them. Every spring, our extended family books the same lakeside lodge for a weekend of big meals, lawn games, and boat rides. The place had wide decks, a long dock stretching out over the water, and enough cabins for everyone to have their own space. This year, Lorraine had made sure everyone knew she was in charge of the schedule, meals, activities, even who was supposed to be where at what time. She'd sent out a detailed itinerary by email with the subject line keeping things running smoothly. A few days before the trip, my mom called. She kept her tone even, but I caught the hint of caution in her voice. Word had gotten around that Lorraine was planning a special recognition during Saturday night's dinner. No one knew the exact details, but the phrasing alone was enough to suggest some kind of staged moment. I decided to be ready for anything. When I packed, I included my triple-layer chocolate cake, 2 bottles of a good red wine, and my usual approach: be polite, be steady, and don't let her set the pace. We arrived on Friday afternoon. The air was warm for spring, with a light breeze coming off the water. Relatives were scattered around the property, some on the dock with fishing poles, others unloading groceries into the main kitchen. Lorraine was by the check-in desk, clipboard in hand, assigning cabin keys like a hotel concierge. She greeted me with a quick nod and moved on to the next arrival. The next afternoon, Martin pulled in. His truck kicked up a small cloud of dust on the gravel road, and within minutes, he was surrounded at the fire pit. He had a way of pulling people in without even trying, sharing a story, asking about their week, tossing in the right joke at the right time. From where I was standing near the main lodge, I caught Lorraine watching, as a half-circle of relatives shifted their attention from her updates about dinner prep to whatever Martin was saying. By the time Saturday night rolled around, the long tables were set outside under strings of white lights. The air smelled faintly of grilled chicken and rosemary potatoes. Lorraine had the center seat, with Martin and me directly across from her. The plates and glasses clinked as people settled in, the lake reflecting the last bit of sunset behind us. Dinner ran smoothly, passing dishes, swapping stories, and the occasional burst of laughter loud enough to carry across the water. When dessert was cleared, Lorraine stood. She thanked everyone for coming, her voice carrying easily over the table, and started talking about the people who uphold family values. At first, it sounded like a general thank you, but soon her speech turned into a list of her own contributions. Years of hosting, keeping traditions alive, making sure gatherings ran smoothly. She spoke as if each example proved her place as the anchor of the family. Martin sat back, listening with a faint smile. When she paused, he leaned forward, his tone warm and easy. He thanked her for her hospitality, then shifted the spotlight. He said it was also important to recognize those who had shown kindness and patience, even in tense moments, and who made sure everyone felt welcome. His eyes moved to me, and he mentioned how much effort I had put into keeping family traditions alive. There was a beat of silence, and then several relatives raised their glasses toward me. The applause started small but picked up, rippling down the length of the table. Some people smiled at me, others nodded. Lorraine kept her smile in place, but there was a tightness to it as she joined in the clapping. Afterward, the crowd broke into smaller groups. On the deck, a few cousins leaned against the railing, talking about how nice it was when gatherings felt relaxed and inclusive. They didn't name anyone, but the meaning was clear. Down by the fire pit, Martin was telling a story to a group of uncles, the glow from the flames lighting their faces. Sunday morning was calm. People moved between cabins with coffee mugs in hand, some packing cars, others making plans for boat rides before heading home. In little clusters, conversations about the next get-together were happening. Who could host, possible dates, what kind of food to have. None of it was being run through Lorraine. She stayed cordial, chatting when spoken to, but her presence felt quieter. There was no clipboard in sight, no voice announcing what needed to happen next. By the time the weekend ended, the shift was clear. The family had started to plan differently, not because of a confrontation or a blow-up, but because they'd experienced a version of these gatherings where no one person dictated the flow. Lorraine might still host again, but the balance of influence wasn't hers alone anymore.